let me tell you about my favorite scene in God's Not Dead 4, We the People. So Reverend Dave, remember Reverend Dave? He's kind of the de facto protagonist of the God's Not Dead series. Reverend Dave wears many hats. In addition to guiding his flock and sitting as a juror on landmark religious liberty trials and fending off the state's attempt to steal his church, he's also a homeschool teacher. He teaches divinity to a local community of homeschool kids.
Yeah, guys, let's get to work.
So, okay, he's with these kids and everything's going great. He's teaching a rousing lesson about Noah's Ark.
How do you think people reacted to Noah when he suddenly started to build a big boat?
But today's a little different, a little effed up, because today Ms. Dowd, a social worker, makes an unannounced visit.
I'm Ms. Dowd with Social Services. I'm here to review your homeschooling environment.
Just in case you were wondering how she identifies, by the way, Ms. Dowd is actually self-partnered.
Is Miss short for Miss or Mrs.?
It's not short for anything. It's complete by itself.
Oh, she meant no disrespect. She's just asking if you're single or married, so she might address you properly.
I identify as self-partnered.
Which, good. Anyway, Ms. Dowd observes the class, and at the end of it, she and her partner, also Ms. Dowd, go to talk to Rebecca McKinnon, one of the homeschool moms. She seems pissed off, and she says this.
And the animals? What exactly was the sin that required their destruction? These are my recommendations to the state.
That's so great, I think. And it's great for two reasons. First, that's such a good question. Like, it kind of annoys me how good it is. See, I've read the Noah's Ark story, of course. I mean, I've experienced it many times.
No one said it would be easy building this old ark.
But I've never really given much thought to the animals. I kind of just assumed that God killed them all incidentally, collateral damage in his world-drowning plan. But no, that's not right. Rather, killing all the animals is explicitly one of God's reasons for his great flood. The Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. That is just so odd, isn't it? I think it rightly calls on us to be skeptical, to ask some questions. What was it about these animals that was so upsetting to God? Why did he regret them so much? And if indeed he hated them, why did he call on Noah to preserve their lives, bring them on his big ark? Like, Noah, I get. Noah is the best person in a world of horrible people, the one God thinks is worthy of life. But it's not like God called on Noah to bring the best animals onto his ark, the least sinful ones. No, God regretted his creations, and there's no clear way those creations are going to be getting any better, so why didn't he just, blat shoot them with his gun, as he said he wanted to do? To be clear, I don't think this is some profound atheist point against Christianity. I don't think it's impossible for a Christian to answer this in a way that satisfies them. I just think it's a good point, one that brings home how strange and difficult to parse God is in the Old Testament. And I guess that brings me to the second reason I love this moment. It's so stupid.
Their teachable moment from the Noah myth is obey God or die.
I mean, that's one way to look at it.
Like, has Ms. Dowd ever heard of Catholic school? Parents are very much allowed to teach children about the Bible. They're allowed to put them in schools that teach them about the Bible. And this has been the case, I think, since school was a thing. Her objection here is just incoherent and petulant. You teach children about Noah? Well, I have news for you. He doesn't exist. I'm gonna destroy your life. I guess this moment has what I enjoy most about God's Not Dead movies. This feeling like they're trying to engage with and debate secularism and atheism, but can do so only under the assumption that anybody who is not Christian is a crazy person. Jeff the professor from the first movie can't just be an atheist who makes some decent points. He must actually despise God because he's so sad.
You will find the most committed atheists were once Christians. But we took the blinders off.
The lawyer from the second movie, Peter Kane, he doesn't believe in the Constitution. He's trying to prove once and for all that God is dead.
We're going to prove once and for all that God is dead.
Ms. Dowd is not a social worker with a few interesting questions about the Bible. She's going to kill you. She is going to kill your homeschool daughter. It's such overt and self-martyring propaganda, and there's a kind of joy in that, in watching these films negotiate between thinking through the claims and questions of the people who disagree with them and conveying that these people are repugnant liars who don't even believe the arguments they're making. It's good, you know? It's a good time. So, okay, what if I told you that this stupid moment from the first 10 minutes of God's Not Dead 4 was the last truly fun moment of the entire series? The last time a God's Not Dead movie felt like a God's Not Dead movie. Part 1. God's Not Dead, We the People, made in 2021, is, as you can no doubt guess, about a homeschool that gets into legal trouble for loving Jesus too much.
We are concerned that these children may not acquire the essential skills for good citizenship and further learning.
And while it might be boring to point out, I think I have to begin here with the basic observation, that's not a real thing. That's essentially not a thing that happens to people. At the end of almost every God's Not Dead movie is a list of court cases that supposedly inspired the movie. And one doesn't need to do much research to see they couldn't come up with anything here. Actually, let's go through it for a second. In Doe v. Madison, parents sued a school district for allowing students to come out as trans and adopt a different gender identity without telling their parents. In Greenville Independent School District v. Barrow, a public school teacher was passed up for promotion because she didn't want to move her child from a private Catholic school to the public one she worked at. She sued the school district over it and won her case. In Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue, Montana gave tuition assistance to parents sending their kids to private school, but excluded religious schools because their state constitution prohibited giving taxpayer money to religious institutions. And this, it turns out, was found unconstitutional in the Supreme Court. In People v. DeJong, the Michigan Supreme Court found the state's requirement for homeschool teachers to be certified didn't apply if you had a religious objection to the certification requirements. In the matter of Scarlett Z, the Illinois Supreme Court found that a woman's boyfriend had no custody rights over a child they essentially adopted together. I don't know what that's doing there, honestly. That doesn't seem to be about education at all. I don't know what point they're making with that one. In the matter of CJC, that's another case where someone's boyfriend was found not to have custody rights. In Dieter versus Harner, that seems to be another unrelated custody case concerning the parental rights of a child's biological father. Really pertinent information. Anyway, we could go on, but you get the point, right? There is no case God's Not Dead can point at where homeschooling religious parents were held to some greater unfair scrutiny, where a Christian parent was told they had to rein in the religious education of their child. And that makes sense because homeschooling is almost exclusively regulated on a state-by-state basis, and the states, generally speaking, are extremely permissive. The majority of states require no obligatory assessment for homeschool kids, have no necessary qualification for homeschool teachers. 11 states don't even require that parents notify the government when they pull their child into homeschool. You don't have to tell anyone in the state of Texas that your dearest son Hunter won't be receiving an education. That's fine with them. Go, they say. Fuck off. But okay, why should we honestly care about any of this? I mean, if you've seen any of these movies, you know that they're not exactly known for their gritty realism.
You're beautiful. I wish you not to do that.
It's for my father. He's very traditional.
So what's up? Why am I suddenly invested in the verisimilitude of a God's Not Dead movie? Well, the answer to that is simple. It's because it matters now. Fundamentally, God's Not Dead, We the People wants to ask a question. What if we made the God's Not Dead franchise political? That sounds weird, I guess. I mean, God's Not Dead has always been political, right? It's not apolitical to tell a story about how God is good and we should all worship him. It's not apolitical to imagine atheists as desperate losers who secretly hate God.
Do you hate God?
It's not even a question.
Okay. Why do you hate God?
This is ridiculous.
Why do you hate God? Answer the question.
It's not apolitical to make a movie about how a poor, sad teacher got effed over just for talking Christ.
The writer of the Gospel of Matthew records Jesus as saying, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you."
Just for talking just for talking Christ for a second. And sure, that's true, but We the People feels different. Unlike the other movies, it's a film about this pressing, hot-button subject, the status of homeschools in the United States. It's an issue that is actively fought for by Christian conservative lobbying groups. The Homeschool Legal Defense Association is pretty massive, pretty radical, and pretty litigious against any form of homeschool regulation. And it's an issue that represents one of conservative Christianity's biggest and most important political victories. The erosion of homeschool regulation has been a sweeping success for conservative activists. God's Not Dead 4 is not content to tell a story about how Christianity is good or about how atheists are cringe.
Do you think you're smarter than me, Wheaton? Do you think there's any argument you can make that I won't have an answer for?
Rather, it is invested deeply in the politics and practice of right-wing Christianity. It wants to show clips of Ronald Reagan and suggest itself as part of his sainted ideological project.
Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction.
It wants to fight a war that real conservatives are fighting and winning. It wants to argue a case that matters, that people care about. That might sound good. That might sound like it would make for an interesting change to the God's Not Dead formula. The result, though, is just a very strange movie. Part 2. It doesn't take long for the cracks to appear in God's Not Dead 4. In fact, a simple summary of its plot can reveal a surprising amount of strangeness in this movie. After Ms. Dowd sits in on the homeschool Bible lesson, she's none too pleased and claims that it's not a good educational environment for these children, specifically the children of Mike and Rebecca McKinnon. The issue goes to court where Judge Elizabeth Neely, played by Janine Pirro for some reason, agrees with Dowd. And it seems like that mostly comes down to these 4 stated reasons.
1, lack of instructional effectiveness. 2, an environment inferior to a group learning experience. 3, the parents' inability to cover all intellectual areas. And 4, the absence of sufficient equipment, especially in the sciences.
As she orders, the McKinnon children must return to public school or their family will face severe fines. Mike and Rebecca are about to fold, but then Pastor Dave gets an idea. What if we fight this?
I think we should fight this. We need to.
What if we go down to Washington and plead our case before a congressional subcommittee on the merits of homeschooling? And that's what the movie's about, the congressional hearing. Did you catch the problem there? Honestly, it's kind of hard to catch because it feels somehow too obvious to notice. Guys, what are you hoping to get out of this congressional hearing? Like I said that Pastor Dave wants to fight the judge's orders, and that's certainly how he acts about it.
I will personally cover the cost of any fines, if we have to.
David, unless you won the lottery, there's no way you'll be able to pay for all this.
Unless you're betting you won't have to.
I have faith that I won't have to.
But how does acting as a witness before this random committee have anything to do with the court order that they received? The federal government isn't going to overrule the state's decision here. States are fully allowed to regulate their own homeschooling protocols. And in any case, the McKinnons don't go to federal court. They go to Congress.
This is not a courtroom, Ms. Hayes, and I most certainly am not a judge.
And Congress in this movie never does anything regarding the McKinnon homeschool. This entire Washington plot, what makes up the brunt of the film, it has nothing to do with anything. It's just fully meaningless. What's really puzzling is that I'm not the only one who's aware of this gaping chasm at the heart of God's Not Dead 4. No, the movie is too. Let's jump to the end of the story for a moment. After the congressional hearing, after Pastor Dave gives his inspirational speech, we'll talk about it later.
I'm talking to the people who elected you. Because as inconvenient as it is, sir, this is where your power comes from.
The movie effectively ends. And in the final musical montage sequence, we see Judge Neely, now converted to loving homeschool, decide that she actually wants to allow the McKinnons to homeschool their kids in peace.
Love explode and bring the dead to life.
Yes, the plot of the film, its most central conflict, is resolved in a wordless 2-second sequence just before the end. Why? Why did they do it like that? Yes, the other God's Not Dead movies don't make much sense. No professor has ever demanded his students avow atheism before starting class. No church has ever been stolen by the government for loving Jesus too much.
This is absurd. They can just take the church from us. I mean, don't we own this land?
Yes.
So how is this legal?
Eminent domain. I studied property law a bit in grad school.
But at least they tell a story, right? Have a through line. Someone says God is dead, then they get hit by a car, and they love God after that.
Do you accept him as Lord and Savior?
Yes.
It's a good movie. He goes to heaven. Now, I'm not gonna say I know why they included this strange glitch in God's Not Dead 4. It was probably just a stupid oversight in a stupid movie, but I do think that it's meaningful, that it does something profound for the story. Simply put, it allows the film to escape from its own confining stakes. Like, as you saw before, there were some pretty concrete reasons why the judge decided that the McKinnon kids weren't being served well by their homeschool. Insufficient expertise from the parents, lack of socialization, and absence of science equipment. If these parents were to go to court, they'd presumably have to speak to these points, argue for their own competence and for the welfare of their kids. And while I'm sure that would be an interesting movie, what it's not is very religious. There isn't much room for vague political grandstanding in a movie about assessing the science equipment at a local homeschool. There's no space there for what really matters, Jesus and the mean government.
But surely you recognize how offensively patriarchal and sexist the Bible is?
And so, leaving all that stuff behind to go to Congress, it's such a good excuse to make the movie less specific and more God-oriented. It allows the film to signify an allegiance to the profound goodness of conservative Christian homeschooling without attending to the unwanted details that conversation implies. Put another way, it allows the film to gesture politically and be about nothing. Part 3. God's Not Dead 4 is extremely unclear as to what this congressional committee is here to talk about. They kind of just spend most of their time acting nasty about homeschool.
Our department considers homeschooling an unusual, unnecessary, and borderline antisocial practice.
And so it can be hard to piece together why they're here, what laws they want to pass. Still, there is one scene that gives us some idea.
You have a strong attachment to the idea of developing a nationalized curriculum, do you not?
Yes, because it's in the best interest of our children. We merely propose the guidelines, and the states adopt the measures on their own.
On their own, without any pressure from the government?
None whatsoever.
Mr. Willoughby, if you succeed in gaining approval for your curriculum, would parents be able to opt out or be allowed to opt out of their program?
I'd encourage the states to require full participation, without exception.
And what gives them the right to do that?
Well, once we determine what every child needs to know, it becomes imperative that every child know it. After all, the children belong to all of us.
I love that this guy's a demon, by the way. Once we determine what every child needs to know, they all must know it. Yes, it seems like the government's evil plan here is to recommend that states voluntarily adopt a nationalized standardized curriculum and that they maintain that curriculum for homeschool kids. Much like the HSLDA, God's Not Dead 4 wants to fight against any and all form of homeschool regulation. Now, I think you can kind of imagine what a movie like that is supposed to look like. If you want to fight regulations, you're probably going to want to argue that those regulations are bad in some way. Maybe it's unfair to regulate homeschools when public schools in the US still aren't all that good. Maybe it's simply not possible to regulate homeschools. Maybe any form of regulation represents an unconstitutional attack on religious freedom. These are all points made by Michael Farris, head of the HSLDA, and while I think they're all pretty bad and shallow, you might assume that God's Not Dead would take a similar tack. But no, that's not how things shake out. Much in the same way that the movie avoids its narrative stakes, it also seems deeply uncomfortable with its ideological stakes, with whatever point it's supposedly trying to make. More often than not, the film has nothing to do with homeschool regulation. It's more just an hour-and-a-half-long infomercial about how you, personally, should homeschool your kid. Like, one thing the movie really wants to convey to its audience is that homeschools are good. There's an entire subplot where a teenage homeschool boy, the McKinnon's eldest son, woos a normal public school girl.
Like what you see?
Huh?
The car.
And while the two do have amazing chemistry...
Well, I was just kind of wondering...
If it's a good car?
Yeah.
It's actually an awesome car.
This plot doesn't really have a lot to it. The entire point is obviously to suggest that stereotypes about homeschool kids are untrue. You know, they're kids just like everyone else. It's easy for them to get car woman. We also see this argument made in another scene, where a homeschool mother explains that she believes normal stuff and isn't even dumb at all.
My 7-year-old knows that the earth is round and that the sunrise is an illusion caused by the earth's rotation.
And when tested in physics or chemistry about the rate of acceleration of a falling object or the atomic mass of cesium, acceptable answers do not include Jesus or whatever God wants it to be.
This movie is like 80% speeches, by the way. It's hard to convey just how much of the movie is like this.
My husband was a United States Air Force pilot who fought for our freedoms and died in service to this country. So if it's all the same to you, I would prefer you call me Mrs. Hayes.
My husband died protecting homeschool chairman. So the point here, once again, is to destigmatize the homeschool identity and establish that they're not all weirdos. And that's fine, you know? I don't inherently have a problem with that. But the problem is, it's completely irrelevant to the topic at hand. Of course, some homeschools are good, but the purpose of regulation clearly is to try to make sure that all homeschools are good, or at least adequate. Let me take a step back for a second. In Professor Robert Kunzman's 2009 book, Write These Laws on Your Children, he goes to 6 conservative Christian homeschools, speaks to parents and to their children, and reports his results. And while not every homeschool he audits has the same level of quality, I was genuinely struck by some of the horror stories in the book. I could choose 2 or 3 examples here, but for the sake of time, I'll just zoom in on one: the Riviera family from California. The Rivieras are voluntarily involved with a homeschool program that has certain curriculum requirements, and they achieve many of those requirements by doing the absolute bare minimum, often just watching something or listening to a tape. As Lydia Riviera, the mother, says, when they're playing, they'll have classical music going on, which counts for music credit, and they'll watch an educational video or something on PBS that might be half related to science. The learning keeps going on its own, but sometimes we'll figure, did you do heritage studies? Well, maybe we should watch Little House on the Prairie. We have Good Eats, which is a Food Network show we have on DVD, and it's just so cool, so educational. We watch that a lot. For the health requirement, I'm reading from the book here, Lydia tells the girls to watch a Pee Wee Herman video. Pee Wee is afraid to go to the dentist even though his tooth hurts, but eventually he relents and finds out that the dentist can help him feel better. Beyond that message, there's little health content, but no matter, the girls don't really pay attention anyway since they've already seen it several times. 7-year-old Veronica remarks that she's never been to the dentist before. For math education, Lydia will often count going to the grocery store or Disneyland, where she asks her kid to buy a few things. That's teaching budgeting, I guess. It's not just the lackluster education standards, though, it's also the failure to be responsive to her kids' educational needs. Lydia's daughter Veronica is hard of hearing, and Lydia is neither emotionally nor practically prepared to deal with the implications of that disability. Lydia gets extremely frustrated and sarcastic at her daughter for mispronouncing words, and at one point brings Veronica to tears over her mispronunciation of the word "word." And because she doesn't know how to teach reading, particularly not to somebody who can't hear well, she just has Veronica read the same book over and over again until she memorizes it. Now, to reiterate, my point is not that all homeschools are like this, uniformly horrific. It's quite hard, in fact, to come to definite conclusions about what homeschools are like. The lack of regulation and mandatory oversight make it extremely difficult to say how well homeschool kids do on average, how common truly terrible homeschools really are. My point, though, is that what the Rivieras are doing is completely legal. They're not exploiting a loophole, they're not evading the law, they are abiding entirely by the words and spirit of California's policies. And given that, it just doesn't make sense for God's Not Dead to say, well, we're not all crazy, we don't all believe the earth is flat, some of us give a pretty decent education. Okay, what about the people who do? Because if you're against regulations of any kind being imposed on homeschools, those are inherently the people who you're defending. It's an uncomfortable thing admitting you don't believe children are owed an education, and so they just don't do that. Homeschools are great, they say. Some ladies even worked at NASA one time, I'm guessing.
I completed an advanced degree in aerospace engineering and worked as a systems engineer in Houston at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
NASA.
Okay, let's move on to another strange argument that the film wants to make. Put simply, that God is real and cool, and that this is an important thing to say to our nasty God-hating government. You see this point raised with Pastor Dave's constant defenses of the Bible.
The Gospels describe Jesus as teaching his followers to forgive each other, to love their enemies, show generosity to those in need, and embrace those outside their ethnic circles. Would you call that divisive?
You see it in the scene we just talked about with NASA Mom.
You see, my concern is that our children will not live up to their full potential by being subject to a faith-based education which is anti-rational and anti-science.
And you see it when Representative Daryl Smith, the one good Christian politician, says this to Dave.
They are going to insist that religious beliefs are anti-rational, anti-science, and antisocial. Show them that religious beliefs are supported through rational thought with a basis on the U.S. law and tradition.
It might not look it, but this is a really peculiar moment. See, conservative Christian homeschool defenders like to frame everything through the lens of religious freedom. They, secular people, are attempting to legislate away my right to convey Christianity to my child. Don't think about the substandard education some homeschool kids are receiving. Don't worry about qualifications or testing. If you read the Bible, you'd see that it says pretty clearly that laws shouldn't apply to cool guys like me. So we're off the hook here, it turns out. Don't worry about it. It's always a terrible argument, but here it's actually being profoundly undermined. No, Reverend Dave does not have to show to the government that believing in Christianity is rational or intellectual. It is, in fact, completely irrelevant to the case being made. Christianity is a religion. It does make faith-based claims, and the First Amendment is objectively the bedrock that allows parents to convey it freely to their children. On some level, the creators of this movie must know this, reckon with this. I mean, why else does the movie constantly talk about freedom? Why else is it called We the People? Yet here, the film just ignores this, the most important part of its own case. Why should we be allowed to teach kids about Christianity? Well, because Jesus Christ is God, and because God created the earth 6,000 years ago or whatever. These are provable facts about the world, and so kids should learn them.
No one has a monopoly on the truth, Mr. Hill. Not even you.
No, but if God exists, then he has the monopoly on it. And we hold that he does exist and has spoken.
Your truth, sir, not mine.
Except that's not the way that truth works. Truth is truth for everyone and everywhere.
This is all probably nice to hear if you're a Christian. It's always fun to watch a movie that tells you that your beliefs are awesome. But if you're arguing against government regulation, it just doesn't make much sense. After all, you can't prove that the events of the Bible happened. If the standard for religious homeschool is academic rigor, a claim to objective truth, it would have been banned long ago. Let's briefly talk about one more argument, one that kind of relates to this one. It's that public schools, are bad. They're teaching my 7-year-old about birth control and probably anal sex.
You know the Andersons, right? Okay, all their kids go to Oakwood. Maddie Anderson brought that home from school.
This is an advertisement for birth control.
Yeah. They passed it out in class. Maddie's in the 2nd grade. He's 7.
They don't teach kids enough about how religious and dope America is.
And so if our children are forced onto its Common Core track, they will never learn about the faith-based underpinnings of the U.S. Constitution or its Bill of Rights. They'll never hear about George Washington's plea for the blessing of Almighty God at his inauguration.
They tell kids about how some founding fathers owned slaves because they hate rights.
And as far as owning slaves, absolutely, some did. But many did not. But they all get tarred with the same brush.
But why? To what end?
If you discredit them, then you discredit what they gave us.
To be clear, this is not merely an argument for conservative Christians to homeschool their kids, it's the argument, the essential reason why homeschooling is important to them. Across Kunzman's book, each family's primary motivation for homeschooling was to maintain the purity and innocence of their children, to raise kids who are in the world but not of it, to assure that the beliefs of conservative Christianity are reproduced and left unchallenged. Still, we have to ask, what movie are we even watching here? What is the plot? What are these characters fighting against? Because this is not an argument to Congress relating to the children you want to be able to homeschool. It's not about government overreach or policy. No, really, it's just an argument that we should force public school teachers to convey the goodness of Christianity, that we should reconstruct the United States bit by bit until it is just one big conservative homeschool. And I think it's pretty meaningful that to the creators of this movie, those two things, destroying public schooling and fighting against homeschool regulation, are one and the same, genuinely indistinguishable. Part 4. At the end of God's Not Dead 4, Reverend Dave gives his big speech, a stirring cry against the evil chairman of the evil congressional subcommittee. And it is, like, borderline gibberish.
You are out of order, Mr. Hill. History is being rewritten. Biology is redefined, and right and wrong are erased.
I don't mean that he doesn't make sense. I mean that he just kind of yells a lot of freedom-related buzzwords. I have an African friend who gets it.
And the funny thing is they're not even from America. They're from faraway places like China, Iran, Africa. But they get it.
You work for us.
Order! You see those statues and those monuments out there? They say, you work for us.
Saying that kind of thing is a huge fantasy for me personally, by the way. You work for us, Mr. President. It just seems like it would feel fucking amazing.
A government of the people, by the people, for the people.
The whole speech feels so empty and strange and bereft of content. He does mention homeschool, the putative subject of the movie, but he does it in a way that makes it feel like an afterthought.
So stay out of our homes and churches, and yes, stay out of our children's education.
Honestly, it's a speech that could have been delivered in any movie, a generic rendering of what political speeches are supposed to sound like, and nothing more. That's a fitting conclusion, I guess, for a movie that is so afraid of its own politics, that aims to tell a story about policy and ideology and homeschool, but which cannot engage with these ideas, argue its case with any kind of thought or purpose. In the end, the film's central idea is left largely unexamined, stated once toward the middle of the movie, and then ignored.
There are parents waiting in the wings, waiting to testify that their children, in fact, belong to them.
Children belong to us, absolutely and unconditionally. If you want to know why the final list of cases includes 3 unrelated examples of American courts only allowing custody rights to biological parents, this is it. Because the movie isn't about defending homeschool, not really. It's about control, about public schools that feel entitled to teach students true things that their parents may not like, about policymakers who believe that children are owed anything, owed a substantial education, about courts who decide that a child's de facto step-parent may have some custody rights. All these institutions, experts, school districts, governments, courts are presumed evil because they do not willingly submit themselves to the one hierarchy that truly matters, the hierarchy imposed by the American Christian father. In a way, it makes sense that the movie refuses to justify an idea like this. To justify it, to give the audience anything but banal freedom-related platitudes would be to admit that it requires justification, to say that conservative Christians must ever explain themselves to anyone. And so, refusing that, what do we get? An empty movie, a movie that is built to be empty. Part 5. So last year, 2024, they made another God's Not Dead movie, God's Not Dead, In God We Trust. And in every way, it's just kind of a sad, tired film. Because I can't imagine ever talking about it on its own, I figure we might as well cover it here. A kind of epilogue, I guess. A few weeks before an election in Arkansas, the Republican candidate dies. Because Reverend Dave went viral, got 60 million views with his amazing homeschool speech from last movie.
Don't forget about the battles that we fought and the price that we paid for freedom.
The party decides that he should run for Congress. And that's what the movie's about. Dave wants to be a politician now, wants to bring Jesus to Washington, and he's fighting against the evil Democrat Peter Kane.
I won't stop until your so-called moral high ground crumbles beneath your feet.
That's the same guy from God's Not Dead 2, by the way.
I don't mean to offend anyone who may be a Muslim here, and I do not want to slight the Prophet of Islam.
And I was honestly pretty pumped to see him again. In the first moments of In God We Trust, we once again hear Ronald Reagan. We see B-roll of vaccines and ominous footage of someone writing the word evolution on a chalkboard. Watching this, I can't deny that I got pretty excited. Wow, we're really in for it with this one, I thought. We're gonna finally have to talk about and affirm the complex and conspiratorial world of real right-wing Christian activism. After all, this movie is even more politically engaged than the fourth movie is. It's overtly about how Christians have to become legislators and vote.
40 million Christians don't vote. And another 15 million aren't even registered.
Of course, it's going to pursue its agenda more explicitly. You know, maybe somebody could bring out a monkey and be like, are you telling me that this monkey is my mom? And then maybe like an evil atheist character could be like, yes. But no, you know, it doesn't happen like that. In fact, God's Not Dead 5 is kind of a hard movie to talk about, and that's because it just takes every strange thing about the fourth installment and turns up the dial. Where the fourth movie at least pretends to be about this big, important subject, Christian homeschooling, G's Not D5 literally cannot come up with anything to say. It is in fact terrified at the prospect of thinking about government with any kind of moral conviction. To get at what I mean, let's talk about one of the most telling plot threads in the movie, about an abused woman's shelter. So at the beginning of the movie, we learn that this shelter lost government funding because some woman there held a Bible study.
The government pulled the grant money because, are you ready for this? Some women at the center had a Bible study.
And it seems like this is our inroad to the stakes of the film. See, Peter Kane wants to take the government's current anti-religious policy and go crazy with it. Stop funding any institution that has any trace connection to Christianity.
If he wins, any institution with a religious affiliation would be exempt from public funding, and I do mean any. Daycare center, nursing home, women's shelter.
And that makes sense as a God's Not Dead plot, right? It makes sense that Dave would want to fight against such a thing. But then later on, Dave and Kane have a debate, and the one topic under discussion is government services. Kane believes in universal health care.
Well, yes, I think that health care is a right and not a privilege.
And Dave thinks, you know, we can't be having that. We have to spend less.
Senator, we need solutions that empower people, not bankrupt
You don't know
our
anything
country.
about the debt.
I know we should spend less.
Well, so you would deny people health care because of the cost?
That's not what
That's
I
your
said.
Christian
That's not what I
charity?
said.
Also, since we're talking about this debate, I just have to pause for a second and talk about the moment that ends it, which I'm going to play in its entirety.
While our money says in God we trust, it's clear where your trust lies, in the pursuit of power and not in the principles that shape this nation.
Go to commercial. Let's go to commercial. Go commercial.
We'll be back after a short break.
And we're clear. 2 minutes. Last look. Stan, get in here.
I didn't edit it this way. I didn't do shit. Peter Kane sits in silence for 16 seconds upon hearing what Reverend Dave has to say. Me when somebody wishes me a Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays. Me when I'm forced to realize that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. So okay, does Dave want more funding for public services or less? Are we too in debt or do we need to be spending more? If he's elected, what is he gonna do? Here, the one time Dave makes any overt reference to actual government policy, he leaves us totally confused as to what he wants, what he's actually fighting for.
If our currency offends you so much, why not spend less of it?
So what happens? How do they resolve this tension? Well, in the end, Dave just uses money donated to his campaign to build the shelter again.
Turns out the law allows you to spend campaign money on things like the Women's Center.
We don't have to deal with believing anything about politics or its role in our lives. Dave's got it covered with campaign finance loopholes. In the end, this contrived plot beat allows the movie to avoid saying anything, and you know, that's an odd thing for a movie about a political race to do. One of the most interesting moments of the film happens right toward the end, another debate between Reverend Dave and Peter Kane. Kane once again starts arguing for government services, you know, we need to help people, blah, 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 fuck off.
You call it interference. I call it a caring government that provides for its citizens.
And Jesus enters the conversation.
After all, do unto others. Isn't that the main message of Christianity? Is it not?
No.
And isn't love thy neighbor central to the teachings of Jesus?
No, Senator. Central to the teachings of Jesus is Jesus. Why is it every 4 years we have to watch a politician take Jesus off their shelf, find a Bible verse that they found on someone else's Instagram page and use just a piece of it in order to advance their political agenda.
So the point of this moment is obvious, right? It's just a teardown of Democrats using the Bible to encourage any form of progressive policy. But still, I can't help but think there's something more profound going on here, because in this moment, Dave is kind of refusing the possibility that his faith might mean anything. However much the libs might annoy you with it, Jesus did say to love your neighbor, did say to treat others as you want to be treated, did say that it's hard for rich people to go to heaven. And while I can't know whether or not Jesus would support the modern welfare state, I think it's at least worth thinking about, right? Worth responding to, if you care about this stuff. But here, none of that matters.
Senator, you seem to miss the one key and vital point.
No, you missed the point. The point today...
The only reason Jesus' teachings of love thy neighbor resonates is because he was the Son of God, the creator of the universe.
The movie wants Christianity involved in politics, wants us to honor our religious heritage or whatever, but it can't imagine what that involvement actually looks like. We do not think about Jesus, and we will not be confronted by the things he said, especially not when they challenge us. This, Christianity, is an identity we like having, an identity that society should privilege and cater to, and that conveniently slots into some amorphous conservative politics. And everything else, everything outside that identity, is to be ignored and undermined, placed in the margins of the text. Part 6. God's Not Dead, the film series as a whole, has always been invested in the idea of Christian martyrdom at the hands of outsiders. Jeff the Professor wants to bully students into hating God. The school district wants to bully Sabrina the Teenage Witch into hating God. The college wants to bully Reverend Dave into hating God. Ms. Dowd wants to force the homeschool into hating God. That's what I talked about at the beginning of this video, right? It's what makes these movies fun.
And the animals? What exactly was the sin that required their destruction?
This martyr narrative was admittedly lacking in the fourth movie. With the exception of Ms. Dowd, who I love and respect, and who unfortunately leaves the movie 10 minutes in, the antagonists there feel much too arbitrary and unthinking and unimportant to really get the audience emotionally invested, make us feel like Christians are being persecuted. But now, there's just nothing. No antagonist with any kind of scheme or plan. No protagonist even. No good reason why Dave wants to be in Congress. No idea what he actually hopes to get out of this story. And in the absence of this false sense of victimization, this divine purpose, this motivation, what we get is nothing. Boring, paint-by-numbers religious buzzwords that don't even attempt to cohere into a movie. And maybe that makes sense. After fantasizing for 10 years now about the secular world coming to get you and your family, maybe the act gets old. The Christianity of this film is done being oppressed, done explaining itself, done obsessing over its own martyrdom and self-sacrifice. They are here now to remake the country in their image, and they're tired, it seems, of pretending otherwise, pretending that they have a story to tell. So did you like that video? I had such a great time making it, man. I made so few videos in 2024, and it was so nice to go back to what I'm used to, making fun videos monthly. I really want to keep doing that, at least for a while. Anyway, if you did like the video, and if you want to support my work and watch more of it, then consider going to my Patreon or to Nebula. On both platforms, you'll find my monthly bonus videos. This month, I talk about the strange and kind of horrific world of YouTubers talking about Disney adults.
Well, at least it used to be the land of abundant joy and happiness for children until 5XL women just started to flood the parks.
And I think it's a pretty good time. I liked doing it. And you can find a link to those things in the description and maybe pinned comment, I don't know. Anyway, now it's time for my Patreon question of the video. Alexander Liptak asks, fuck, marry, kill, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Dennis Prager. I think I would have sex with Ben Shapiro.